I found the text at 6 in the morning. Not because I was awake at 6, because I had not slept. I had been sitting at my desk in the Charleston study since 4:30, going through a contract review that did not require my attention until Thursday, which told me that my mind had already understood something my conscious self was still refusing to name. The desk lamp was on. The harbor was dark outside the window. The house was the particular quiet of a house that has been empty of children for long enough that the quiet has stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like the texture of the place itself. The text was from Margaret, sent at 2:17 in the morning. Check the wallet. 3 words, no punctuation. The kind of message a person sends when they are not certain they will have another opportunity to send it and need to make what they say count. I called her immediately, straight to voicemail. Her voice, recorded and calm, asking me to leave a message. I called Vivienne, voicemail. I called Aaron, voicemail. I sat at the desk and looked at the wallet. It had been with me for 15 years, brown leather, worn at the corners, the stitching along the left edge beginning to separate in the way that things separate when they have been handled daily for long enough. Margaret had offered to replace it 3 times. I had declined 3 times. Not out of sentimentality exactly, but out of the specific attachment a man develops to an object that has been present at enough of his life that replacing it feels like a revision. I opened it. Cash, cards, the folded receipt from a hardware store on Meeting Street that I had been meaning to remove for 6 weeks. I pressed the interior lining with my thumb. Something was different. The lining along the back panel had been lifted slightly. Not torn, not damaged, but lifted, the way fabric lifts when something has been placed beneath it and then removed, leaving the memory of the displacement in the material itself. Whatever Margaret had placed there was gone, but she had placed something, and she had sent me at 2 in the morning to find it. I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked out to the car. I-77 North runs from Charlotte down through the Carolina corridor and becomes, in the dark, a particular kind of road. The kind that asks you questions you have been avoiding by keeping busy during the day. I drove it at 90 miles per hour with both hands on the wheel and the heater running, and Margaret's text on the phone screen in the cup holder, where I could see it without picking it up. Check the wallet. I had been a litigator for 22 years. I had learned, across those years, to construct arguments that moved from evidence to conclusion with the clean logic of something that could not be reasonably disputed. I applied that skill now, in the dark, on the interstate, to the available evidence. Margaret calls Vivian 2 weeks ago. Vivian is crying. Says Aaron has left her. Says she has no one. Margaret goes to Charlotte. Margaret sends a text at 2 in the morning. Margaret does not answer her phone. Vivian does not answer her phone. Aaron does not answer his phone. Check the wallet. I put the car at 93 and held it there. I cross-examined myself the way I had cross-examined witnesses for 22 years. Placed myself on the stand. Asked the questions I did not want to answer. You received a warning 3 weeks ago. An anonymous message. Your daughter is not who you think. What did you do with it? I deleted it. Why? Because I did not want it to be true. Is that a legal reason or a personal one? It is a father's reason, which is the worst kind because it has nothing to do with the evidence and everything to do with the conclusion you have already decided you prefer. I passed a church on the right side of the highway, small, white, its sign visible in the headlights for approximately 3 seconds. I did not pray for clarity. I had spent 22 years in the business of clarity, and I knew what the evidence was pointing toward, and I did not want it to point there. I prayed for the opposite. God, let me be wrong. Let me be a paranoid old man driving too fast toward nothing. Let me arrive in Charlotte and find them all asleep and my wife safe, and this entire construction of my mind be exactly what it looks like. A tired man frightening himself on an empty highway at 3 in the morning. I held the prayer for about 40 seconds. Then I let it go. And I drove. In the rearview mirror, somewhere around mile marker 60, I caught my own reflection in a brief flash of an oncoming headlight. I looked older than I had expected. Not old, but older. The jaw still set, the shoulders still carrying their weight. The hands on the wheel, still the hands of a man who has been in rooms where other people were afraid and has learned not to be. But something in the eyes that had not been there before this morning, or had been there, and I had not been looking. The mirror showed me a man who already knew. I looked away from it. At mile marker 41, I saw the glow of Charlotte on the horizon. The city's light bleeding upward into the overcast sky, the way cities announce themselves at night. Visible before they are reachable. I took the Briarwood exit at 4:12. The neighborhood was asleep. The oaks along the cul-de-sac stood in the darkness, with the patience of things that have been standing in the same place for a long time, and have no particular investment in what happens beneath them. The house at the end of the drive had its porch light off, 2 cars in the driveway. I parked on the street. I sat for a moment with the engine off. The Charleston harbor was 4 hours behind me. The wallet was in my jacket pocket, with its lifted lining and its absence where something had been. The text was still on the phone screen. Check the wallet. I got out of the car. An elderly woman was standing at the garden gate of the house next door, watching me with the calm attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. A man arriving in the middle of the night because something had gone wrong, and she was the one who knew what. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. I had not told her my name. "I'm Helen Marsh," she said. "I live next door." There are some things I need to tell you about what happened on the night of June 14th. The air was cold, November cold, the damp kind that comes in off the Carolina Piedmont before dawn. I could smell the roses from the garden behind her, dormant and thorned, present in the dark. "Tell me," I said. Helen Marsh was 78 years old and had lived next door to my daughter for 3 years. She told me this the way a person states a credential, not to introduce herself, but to establish why she had the right to say what she was about to say. She had earned the proximity. She had been watching. And on the night of June 14th, she had seen. We stood at her garden gate in the pre-dawn cold while she told me. Margaret had arrived in Charlotte 2 weeks earlier. Helen had seen her in the driveway, recognized the warmth between mother and daughter from a distance, noted the way Margaret carried her overnight bag with the ease of someone who believed she was welcome. In the days that followed, Helen had noticed other things. The way the house went quiet at certain hours. The way Vivienne and Aaron moved through the garden in the evenings, with the low, urgent quality of people conducting conversations they did not want overheard. "I've taught Sunday school for 31 years, Helen said. I know what it sounds like when people are carrying something they shouldn't be carrying. I've heard it in adults, and I've heard it in children. And it sounds the same either way." On the night of June 14th, at approximately 11:40, she had heard Margaret. Not words at first, a sound. The particular sound of a person whose body is failing and who knows it, calling out in the way that bypasses dignity entirely and goes straight to the animal fact of needing help. Helen had gone to her window. She had seen Vivian and Aaron on the back lawn. She had seen Vivian look toward the house and then look away. She looked at the house and then she looked at Aaron, Helen said. And she did not go inside. Helen had called 911. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. They brought Margaret out on a stretcher. Conscious, barely, her hand reaching toward the doorframe as they carried her through it. The instinctive reach of a woman who was not ready to leave. Vivian and Aaron watched from the lawn. They did not ride in the ambulance. They did not follow it. The next morning, both cars were back in the driveway. Helen looked at me steadily. They left about 70 minutes after the ambulance. I don't know where they went. I watched the driveway until 2 in the morning. They came back at 6:43. I know because I wrote it down. She paused. I've been writing things down since June 3rd. I looked at the empty driveway in the pre-dawn dark. 70 minutes. Gone somewhere at midnight. Back before 7. Long enough to make a phone call to someone who should not be called. Long enough to clear a kitchen counter of certain items. Long enough to coordinate a version of events that would be consistent, rehearsed, and ready before any questions arrived. I filed that and said nothing. Which hospital? I said. Carolina's Medical Center, she said, on Blythe Boulevard. The drive took 11 minutes. I parked on the 3rd level and took the elevator to the lobby, and gave Margaret's name at the front desk and was directed to the 4th floor. The elevator took 40 seconds. I counted them because counting was something to do with the part of my mind that was trying to come apart and needed an occupation. Detective Sarah Kowalski was waiting in the corridor outside room 412. She was 44, Charlotte Mecklenburg, PD, with the posture of a person who has spent years walking into rooms where nobody wanted her there, and has made her peace with it. She had a yellow legal pad, and the particular expression of a detective who has formed a preliminary conclusion and is waiting to see whether the person she is meeting will confirm or complicate it. Mr. Whitfield, she said. What happened to my wife? I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, Mrs. Whitfield was admitted at 12:26 this morning with acute cardiac toxicity. Toxicology identified elevated levels of digoxin and warfarin in her system. The digoxin reading was 4.2 nanograms per milliliter. The therapeutic ceiling is 2. The warfarin INR was 6.8 against a safe upper limit of 3. I heard the numbers. I had been a litigator for 22 years, and I had learned to receive difficult information the way you receive a blow when you know it is coming. You do not move away from it. You absorb it. You let it land, and then you assess the damage. I stood in the corridor and received the numbers, and felt, in the palm of my right hand, my fingernails pressing into the flesh at the base of my fingers. Not dramatically, not visibly, just the small, private physics of a body that is holding itself together by exerting pressure somewhere it cannot be seen. Margaret, 4.2, therapeutic ceiling 2. Margaret, 6.8, safe upper limit 3. I uncurled my hand. These levels, I said. My voice was level. I made sure of that. Are they consistent with accidental ingestion? No, Kowalski said. They are consistent with deliberate, repeated administration over a period of several weeks. The medical team's characterization is cumulative poisoning. The corridor was very quiet. I looked at the door of room 412. The 2 people who were in the house with her, I said. Did they ride in the ambulance? No. Did they contact the hospital after she was admitted? No. They left 70 minutes after the ambulance and returned at 6:43, I said. Do you know where they went? Kowalski looked at me with the slight adjustment of attention that detectives make when a civilian asks a question that is more precise than expected. "We're working to establish that timeline," she said carefully. "So do I said. "Because a person who has just watched their mother taken away by ambulance goes to the hospital. They do not leave for 70 minutes at midnight and return before dawn." I held her gaze. "They only go somewhere else if somewhere else is necessary. And somewhere else being necessary means there is something somewhere else that needed attending to before anyone started asking questions." Kowalski wrote something on her legal pad. "There is a category of behavior that the law calls consciousness of guilt. It describes the actions of a person who knows what they have done and makes decisions in the immediate aftermath that only make sense if they are managing consequences rather than responding to a crisis. Consciousness of guilt is not proof of anything by itself, but it is a pattern, and patterns in the right context become evidence, and evidence in the right hands becomes a case." I had 22 years of right hands. "Can I see her?" I said. Kowalski stepped aside. I put my hand on the door of room 412 and stood there for a moment with my palm flat against the wood. I thought about a text sent at 2:17 in the morning, a lifted lining in a wallet, 3 phones going to voicemail, 70 minutes in the Charlotte dark going somewhere that needed to be gone to before the questions arrived. I thought about what my wife had known alone before she sent that text. I thought about what it had cost her to know it and say nothing to protect me. I opened the door. Margaret looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing. Not the monitors, not the IV line in her left arm, not the pale green of the hospital gown against the white of the pillow. The smallness. The way a person looks when their body has been spending everything it has on something more urgent than maintaining its ordinary dimensions. When the effort of simply continuing has consumed the margin that makes a person look like themselves. She was breathing. I stood at the door for a moment and watched her breathe, and felt something in my chest that I did not have a legal term for and did not try to name. Then I crossed to the chair beside the bed and sat down and took her hand and held it the way I had held it the night Vivienne was born, in a different hospital, in a different city, when I was 30 years younger and believed that love was sufficient armor against everything the world intended to send your way. I had been wrong about that. I had been wrong about a number of things. I sat with her for 20 minutes before I looked at the wallet again. Not because I had forgotten it, because some things require a particular quality of attention that cannot be divided, and sitting beside Margaret in that room was one of them. I held her hand and listened to the monitors, and let the 20 minutes be what they were. A man and his wife in a hospital room at 5 in the morning. The ordinary intimacy of 30 years compressed into the specific fact of her hand in mine and the sound of her breathing, and nothing else required. Then I opened the wallet. I had checked the main compartment at the desk in Charleston. I had found the lifted lining and nothing beneath it. But I had not checked the inner pocket, the narrow one behind the card slots, the one I almost never used because it was slightly difficult to open and held nothing except the occasional forgotten receipt. I pressed it open. The wedding ring was there. White gold, 28 years old. The slight irregularity on the inner band where Margaret had had it resized the year after Vivienne was born. I knew this ring the way you know something you have looked at every day for nearly 3 decades, not by examining it, but by the specific weight of its familiarity in the hand. I held it in my palm. Margaret had removed it, had placed it inside the wallet, my wallet, on the entryway table where I always left it, where she knew I would find it. before she got on the plane to Charlotte. She had sent the text at 2 a.m. to make sure I found it in time. She had done all of this knowing what she was walking toward, knowing she might not walk back out of it. And she had made sure that if the worst happened, the truth had a place to live. I sat with the ring cold and certain in my palm and thought about what kind of courage that required. Not the courage of confrontation, the quieter kind. The courage of a person who sees the full shape of a thing and decides, alone, without assistance, to do what can be done from the position they are in. She had been doing that since before I arrived. I placed the ring carefully back in the inner pocket of the wallet. I closed it. I stood up. I called Marcus Reed from the hospital corridor at 5:47. Marcus had been my investigator for 19 years. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been athletic and had traded the athleticism for endurance. And he answered his phone on the second ring at 5:47 in the morning, without any indication that 5:47 was an unusual time to be called. "I need everything on Aaron James Prescott," I said. "Financial records, legal history, current liabilities, property holdings. Everything back to 2010. A pause. "How fast?" "Yesterday," I said. "Give me 6 hours," he said. I called James Calloway next. James was a civil litigator I had crossed swords with across 11 cases over 15 years, which meant I knew exactly how his mind worked and trusted it completely. He answered on the fourth ring with the voice of a man who had been awake but would not admit it. "I need you in Charlotte," I said. "Today." "What happened?" "Margaret is in the ICU. Cardiac toxicity. Deliberate." A silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "I'll be there by noon," he said. I called Gerald Simmons last, estate attorney, Charleston. He and Margaret had been friends since before I knew either of them, which meant he would know things about her affairs that she had managed separately from mine. "Robert." His voice was careful in the way that voices go careful when they already know something is wrong. "Margaret's will," I said. "Has anything changed in the past year?" A pause that was slightly too long for someone who had nothing to say. "Robert," he said, "we should meet in person." "Tomorrow," I said. "Charlotte." "I'll be there." I went back into room 412 and sat beside Margaret again. The morning was coming in through the window now, the Charlotte sky going from black to the particular gray of an early summer dawn that has not yet decided whether it will be clear or overcast. The monitors kept their rhythm. Margaret's breathing was steady and shallow, the breathing of someone whose body was performing the essential functions and holding everything else in reserve. I thought about Aaron Prescott. I had met him 12 years earlier in a Charleston courtroom. He had been 29 years old and had followed the wrong people into a securities fraud scheme with the particular passivity of a man who had convinced himself that proximity was not participation. I had defended him pro bono because the case interested me and because the firm that had recruited him into the scheme had considerably more to answer for than he did. The charges were dismissed. 6 months later, I had introduced him to Vivian at a Sunday lunch at First Baptist Charleston, shaking his hand across a table and thinking that a man who had been given a second chance was a man who understood the value of what he had been given. I had been wrong about that, too. The monitors kept their rhythm. Outside, Charlotte was beginning its morning, the city moving into the first light with the indifferent momentum of a place that had no knowledge of and no particular investment in what was happening on the 4th floor of one of its hospitals. I held Margaret's hand. I thought about the ring in the wallet in my jacket pocket. I thought about what she had known before she got on the plane. I thought about what it was going to cost to find out how much she had known, and for how long. And I thought about the specific, private grief of a man who has spent 22 years finding the truth in other people's lives, and has just been handed the evidence of what has been growing, undetected, in his own. The monitors kept their rhythm. I stayed until the morning nurse came at 6:30. Then I went to find what Margaret had left for me to find. Marcus called at 11:53. I was in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee I had not been drinking, going through the notes I had made on my phone since arriving in Charlotte. Timestamps, names, the 3 answers Kowalski had given me that morning. Helen's observation about the 70 minutes. The cafeteria was running at its midday volume, the ordinary noise of a place where people ate between difficult things. And I had found a table by the window where the noise was slightly reduced, and the light was flat and gray, and asked nothing of me. Marcus did not begin with a greeting. "Aaron James Prescott," he said. "Current financial position. $340,000 in outstanding debt across 6 creditors. Mortgage on the Briarwood property 4 payments behind. Foreclosure proceedings initiated 8 weeks ago. Investment portfolio liquidated at a loss of approximately $220,000 over the past 18 months. A pause. He is, in the most precise financial sense, underwater. I looked at the untouched coffee. "And 12 years ago?" I said. "Securities fraud. Charleston Federal Court. Charges dismissed. Defense counsel." A pause that was slightly longer than necessary. "Robert Allen Whitfield." I said nothing. "The scheme," Marcus continued, "involved misrepresentation of fund performance to retail investors. Prescott was a secondary party. He processed paperwork, attended meetings, signed documents he later claimed not to have read. The primary architects received federal sentences. Prescott walked. Another pause. "With your help." The cafeteria noise continued around me. Silverware, chairs, the ordinary machinery of people eating lunch. "Same playbook," I said. 12 years later. "Larger scale," Marcus said. "Better executed, and with considerably more personal motivation." I thought about the Sunday lunch at First Baptist Charleston. Aaron Prescott's handshake across the table. The warmth of a man who wanted very much to be liked, and had learned, at some point, that being liked was a useful thing to be. "He knew exactly what I was," I said. "From the moment I introduced him to Vivian, he knew the kind of man I was, and the kind of man I would become if someone hurt my family." "Yes," Marcus said. "And he married my daughter anyway." "Yes." I picked up the coffee cup. I did not drink from it. I held it and felt the lukewarm ceramic against my palm, and thought about what it means to defend a man and believe in the defense, and then watch the man spend the next 12 years proving that the belief was the error rather than the defense. "Keep going," I said. "I want everything." Gerald Simmons arrived in Charlotte at 2 in the afternoon. He was 63, with the careful, unhurried manner of an estate attorney who has spent his career delivering information that people were not prepared to receive, and has learned that the delivery matters as much as the content. He met me in a conference room on the 2nd floor of a building 3 blocks from the hospital, a room that smelled of carpet cleaner and the particular neutrality of spaces rented by the hour. He opened his briefcase and placed a document on the table between us. "Margaret came to my office 8 months ago," he said. "She came alone. She did not tell you she was coming." I looked at the document. It was a will. Margaret's name at the top, the date 8 months prior, Gerald's notarial seal at the bottom. I read it. I read it twice. Vivian's name did not appear. Not reduced. Not conditioned. Not mentioned in any capacity. The entire estate, the Charleston house, the investment accounts, the trust instruments, the accumulated weight of 28 years of a life built together, directed in its entirety to the First Baptist Charleston Charitable Endowment and a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. Vivian had been erased 8 months ago, before I had seen a single warning sign, before the anonymous message I had deleted, before any of the conversations that had reached me through the ordinary channels of a family that was still, at that point, presenting as intact. Margaret had seen it first. She didn't tell me why, Gerald said. He was watching me with the careful attention of a man who has delivered difficult news before and knows that the moment after delivery requires more of him than the delivery itself. She didn't explain her reasoning. She drafted the changes, reviewed them twice, signed them, and left. He paused. She did ask me one question before she left. What question? She asked whether the changes would hold, if she died under circumstances that were later determined to be suspicious. He looked at the document between us. I told her they would, that a properly executed will survives the circumstances of the testator's death, that the only challenge would be a claim of undue influence or incapacity at the time of execution, and that neither applied. He paused. She said, "Good," and she left. The conference room was very quiet. I looked at the will on the table. I thought about Vivian, about the plan she had been building, the digoxin, the warfarin, the 6 weeks of calibrated dosing, the prayer in the garden after the 14th. All of it constructed around a single premise, that Margaret's death would transfer the estate to its named beneficiary. The named beneficiary was a charity. Had been for 8 months. Vivian had planned a murder for an inheritance that no longer existed. The bitter, devastating irony of it settled into the conference room with the flat certainty of a fact that cannot be adjusted. Margaret had known. Margaret had quietly, alone, without drama or confrontation, removed the foundation from beneath everything Vivian had been building. She had done it 8 months before Vivian made her move, which meant she had seen the move coming before Vivian had fully decided to make it. She had not told me. She had protected me from knowing, which was its own kind of love and its own kind of grief. "Gerald," I said. My voice was even. I had made sure of that. "I need a full accounting of the estate as of today, and I need it sealed." "Already prepared," he said. He placed a second document on the table. "Robert?" He hesitated. "She knew what she was doing. 8 months ago. She knew, and she handled what she could handle, and she left you the rest." I looked at the 2 documents on the table. The will that erased Vivian, the estate accounting. The evidence of a woman who had seen the full shape of what was coming, and had done the quiet, unglamorous, essential work of making sure the truth had somewhere to stand when the time came. I had spent 3 days thinking of myself as the man who arrived and built the case. I was beginning to understand that Margaret had been building it for 8 months before I got in the car. I picked up both documents. I put them in my jacket, next to the wallet, next to the ring. I thanked Gerald. I walked out into the Charlotte afternoon and called Marcus and told him to meet me at the hospital at 4 o'clock. We had work to do. Helen Marsh was waiting for me on her porch when I arrived at 7:43 the next morning. She was dressed the way women of her generation dress for important conversations. a pale blue cardigan buttoned to the collar, a cup of tea in both hands, and the particular stillness that comes from having decided, before you open the door, exactly what you are going to say. She asked me to sit. I sat. "I have something that belongs to the truth," she said. She set the tea down, went inside, and returned with a small gray device in a Ziploc bag. A Phonak Audio Paradise hearing aid. The kind with Bluetooth connectivity, automatic scene detection, and, I would learn in the next 3 minutes, a passive recording function that activated whenever the ambient decibel level crossed a certain threshold. Helen had been wearing it in her east garden on the evenings of June 3rd, June 7th, June 11th, and June 14th. The garden shared a wall with the Briarwood property. 12 feet, she said, from where she typically stood to water her roses. She walked me through the recordings one by one, the way a careful person walks you through a document they have already read several times and want you to understand completely before you react. June 3rd, 7:41 p.m. 9 minutes, 17 seconds. 2 voices. One I recognized immediately. Vivian's diction is precise, slightly elevated, the voice of someone who learned early that articulation is a form of control. The second voice was lower, reluctant. Aaron Prescott, confirming details the way a man confirms details when he has already agreed to something and is now simply recording his own compliance. Helen had written the relevant lines in a small notebook she kept in her cardigan pocket. 2 to 3 weeks if the dosage stays consistent. We have to be patient. I read the line 3 times before I looked up. "There's more," Helen said. She was right. The recording continued. Vivian outlined the compound. Digoxin and warfarin, calibrated across a 6-week window to mimic natural cardiac failure. She cited 2 research papers by title. She described the therapeutic ceiling, the number above which a body's rhythm becomes unstable, with the calm precision of someone who had spent months preparing to sound calm. Aaron said almost nothing. What he said quietly, in the register of a man who has decided that participation is less dangerous than refusal. Near the end of the recording, Vivian said, "It's the kindest way, Aaron. She won't feel it until it's already done." I set the notebook down. Helen picked up her tea, held it with both hands, and waited. June 14th, 11:53 p.m. 2 minutes, 4 seconds. The shorter recording was the one that stayed with me. Vivian's voice, alone. No Aaron. A night garden silence underneath. And then her voice. Quieter than the June 3rd recording, stripped of the procedural rhythm. "It's done." A pause of roughly 4 seconds. Then, "Lord, we give thanks for what has been resolved. We ask for peace in what follows. Amen." I sat with that for a long moment. Helen did not try to fill the silence, which told me she had sat with it herself. A prayer. After. Not before. After. I had spent 22 years in courtrooms, and I had heard people say extraordinary things under oath. But I had never heard anyone pray after. It was the detail that removed the last ambiguity. You do not thank God for the resolution of something you have not done. I asked Helen the question I needed to ask. "Did you know what you were recording when you recorded it?" "No," she said. "I knew something was wrong. I had known for weeks. The way a neighbor knows. The way a woman my age knows when a house is carrying something it shouldn't. But I didn't understand what I had until June 15th, when I heard the ambulance." She had not gone to the police immediately. She told me why without my asking. She was not certain the recordings were legal. She was not certain anyone would believe her. She was 81 years old, and she had a neighbor in the ICU and a recording of that neighbor's daughter saying the words, "It's done," 12 minutes before the ambulance arrived. And she had not known what to do with that for 9 days. She had done the only thing she could think of. She had kept the hearing aid in a Ziploc bag, written the relevant lines in her notebook, and waited for someone to come and ask the right question. I told her the recordings were admissible. A private citizen, recording a conversation audible from a shared property line, without a warrant, without intent to surveil. North Carolina is a one-party consent state, and Helen Marsh had not been a party to either conversation. She had simply been standing in her garden. She nodded as if she had known that too, and had simply needed someone with a license to confirm it. I called Detective Kowalski at 9:17 a.m. Kowalski arrived at 10:04, listened to both recordings on Helen's kitchen table, and said nothing for 30 seconds after the second one ended. Then she asked Helen the same question I had asked. Helen gave her the same answer. Kowalski called the evidence lab at 10:21. By 10:47, a technician named Daniel Cho had confirmed the recording's metadata. GPS coordinates placing them within 12 feet of the Briarwood East Garden wall. Timestamps consistent with the dates Helen had noted, and no evidence of digital alteration. 4 recordings. 2 that established planning. 2 that established execution. 1 that ended with a prayer. Kowalski looked at me across the table. "We have enough for a warrant," she said. I thought about the lifted wallet lining, the ring in the hidden pocket, the will with Vivian's name removed 8 months before the plan was put in motion. Margaret had not been waiting to be rescued. She had been building the case before I even knew there was one. She forgot, I said, that some conversations get recorded. Kowalski picked up the Ziploc bag. "We're going to need a room," she said. The photograph was in the bottom of Margaret's overnight bag. James Calloway found it at 11:34 a.m. while cataloging her personal effects. Standard procedure when a victim cannot speak for themselves. He had set aside her reading glasses, her bookmark, a small bottle of hand cream. And then he had gone quiet, in the way James goes quiet when something shifts the weight of a room. He brought it to me without a word. It was a standard 4x6 print, slightly worn at the corners. The kind of photograph that has lived in a drawer for years and been taken out more than once. The image? Vivian at the beach, perhaps 24 years old, laughing at something off camera, her hair pulled back, her shoulders loose. She looked, in that photograph, like a person who had not yet decided what she was going to become. I turned it over. 4 words, written in coral red lipstick, in Margaret's handwriting, pressed firmly enough into the paper that the letters had a slight texture you could feel with your thumb. Forgive her. Not forgive me. Not I forgive her. Just the instruction, direct and imperative, the way Margaret had always given the instructions she considered non-negotiable. I stood in the hallway of Carolina's medical center and held a photograph of my daughter, and read my wife's handwriting, and understood that Margaret had packed this photograph deliberately. She had written those words before she drove to Charlotte. She had known, not guessed, not feared, but known what she was walking into. And she had still gone, because Vivienne was still her daughter. James watched me read it. "She brought it with her," he said. "Yes." "She wanted it found." "Yes." I put the photograph in my jacket pocket next to the wallet. They sat together there, the wallet that had carried the ring, the photograph that carried the instruction. And I felt the particular weight of a person who has arranged things carefully so that someone else can finish what needs to be finished. That afternoon, Marcus called with the last piece. 3 weeks before Margaret's flight to Charlotte, Vivienne had appeared on a local Charlotte television segment. A brief feature on estate planning, filmed in a bright studio, her posture immaculate, her hands folded in her lap. She spoke about family legacy, about the importance of clear documentation, about protecting the people you love from unnecessary grief. Marcus had flagged the segment because of one detail. Vivienne had worn a black blazer and a single strand of pearls. The same outfit she would wear 6 weeks later to her mother's arraignment. The same strand of pearls she would touch once, briefly, when the judge read the charges aloud. I watched the segment twice. I am a lawyer. I have spent 22 years reading people, not what they say, but what they rehearse. Vivienne was not giving an interview. She was practicing. She was practicing grief. The blazer, the pearls, the folded hands, the measured cadence of someone who has decided how a composed, grieving daughter should look and is running the performance before opening night. I turned the television off. I thought about the photograph in my pocket. I thought about Margaret sitting at a kitchen table, writing 4 words in coral red lipstick on the back of a photograph of a laughing girl at the beach. And I thought about what it costs a mother to write those words while knowing what she knows. Then I called Detective Kowalski. I want to talk to her, I said. Robert, not as her father, as a lawyer. One conversation, controlled environment, before the formal arrest. I want her to sit across from me and understand that every piece of evidence she thought was buried has been found. Kowalski was quiet for 3 seconds. Why? I thought about the television segment, the rehearsed grief, the pearls already chosen. Because she has been performing for an audience that doesn't have the evidence yet, I said. I want her to perform for someone who does. Another pause. If she says anything incriminating, then it goes on record. And if she doesn't, then I'll know what kind of trial we're preparing for. The plan took 4 hours to finalize. The 4th floor family consultation room at Carolina's Medical Center, room 416. A contact microphone fitted beneath the table by Daniel Cho that afternoon. A wide-angle camera in the ventilation cover, angled to capture both chairs. Detective Barnes positioned in the hallway, earpiece in, hand on the door. I called Vivienne at 2:17 p.m. I told her Margaret's condition had changed. I told her the doctors needed family present for a care decision. I told her the 4th floor when she arrived. She said, "I'll be there in 40 minutes." Her voice was even, controlled. The voice of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this call and had already decided how she would answer it. I went to room 416 and sat down. I placed the old brown leather wallet on the table between us, centered, visible, deliberate. Not as evidence, as a question. As the object that had started this, the object Margaret had pointed me toward at 2:17 a.m. And now it sat on a table in a wired room, waiting for the woman who had not known it still existed. I had the hearing aid in my jacket pocket. I had the photograph. I had 22 years of courtrooms and one instruction written in coral red lipstick and the specific, focused anger of a man who has held his wife's ring in a hospital hallway and read the word forgive and understood that forgiveness is a task assigned to those who are still standing. At 3:51 p.m. the door opened. Vivienne did not knock. She was dressed in black. Not mourning black, performance black. The blazer she had worn on the television segment, the single strand of pearls at her throat. She had chosen this outfit before she left the house, which meant she had chosen it before she knew what kind of room she was walking into. That told me everything I needed to know about how she had been moving through the last 9 days. She scanned the room in the first 2 seconds, a habit she had inherited from me, though she would not have admitted it. Left wall, right wall, table, chairs. Her eyes landed on the wallet. She did not react. That was its own reaction. "Dad," she said. The word was calibrated, warm enough to establish normalcy, measured enough to establish distance. She sat across from me without being invited. "You said there was a care decision." "I did," I said. "Sit down." "I'm sitting." "Then listen." I had spent 22 years in courtrooms, and I had learned early that the most effective cross-examination is not the loudest one. It is the one that arrives before the witness has finished constructing the answer to the previous question. You do not give them time to perform. You give them facts, one at a time, in the order that removes every exit. I started with the night of June 3rd. "Tell me about the roses," I said. A pause, brief, controlled. "The roses?" "In the East Garden. You were outside after 7 that evening." "I go outside most evenings." "You were speaking with Aaron." "We talk, yes." "About the roses?" "Among other things." I set the gray hearing aid on the table beside the wallet. The pearls moved. A single adjustment at her throat, the reflex of a hand that needed something to hold and found the nearest object. She looked at the hearing aid for exactly 3 seconds, then back at me. "Helen Marsh," I said, "has been wearing that for 6 months. It records automatically above a certain ambient volume. The East Garden shares a wall with Helen's property. 12 feet of shared fence line, as you know." Vivienne said nothing. "There are 4 recordings," I said. "June 3rd, 7th, 11th, 14th. The third one is 9 minutes and 17 seconds. The 14th is 2 minutes and 4 seconds. I paused. "The 14th is the shorter one. It ends with a prayer." The room was very quiet. The contact microphone under the table was picking up everything. The ventilation hum, the particular silence of a person who has just understood the perimeter of their situation and is calculating how much of it is real. "I'd like to call my lawyer," Vivienne said. "You're not under arrest." "I'd like to call my lawyer," she said again. Same cadence. She had been prepared for the possibility of this conversation, too. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed the photograph on the table, face down. She looked at it. She looked at me. "Turn it over," I said. "What is that?" "Your mother packed it in her overnight bag before she drove to Charlotte. James Calloway found it this morning. Turn it over." She did not move. "Vivienne." I said her name the way I had said it when she was 7 years old and had broken something and was standing in the kitchen deciding whether to tell the truth. "Turn it over." Her hand moved to the photograph. She turned it. She looked at the image first, herself at the beach, 24 years old, laughing. Then she turned it further and read the 4 words on the back. The room changed. I had watched a great many people absorb difficult information in courtrooms. The moment a verdict is read, the moment a document is entered into evidence, the moment a person understands that the thing they hoped was not true is true. There is a particular quality to that moment. The body does not always show it, but something behind the eyes does. Vivienne set the photograph down. When she looked up, something in her face had shifted. Not broken, not collapsed, but altered. Like a load-bearing wall that has registered a stress it was not built to carry, and is holding, for now, but differently. She still wrote that, Vivian said, not a question. Yes. She knew. Yes. And she still... She stopped. Yes, I said. She still. The longest silence of the conversation settled between us. I did not fill it. That was the most important thing I had learned in 22 years. When a silence carries something true, you let it carry it. Then Vivian's chin lifted, and the composure returned. Not the natural composure of a person who is at peace, but the constructed composure of a person who has decided the performance must continue. The pearls, the blazer, the folded hands. I want a lawyer present, she said. I won't say anything further without counsel. That's your right, I said. I stood. I gave the signal, left hand open, pressed flat against my jacket for 2 full seconds. The door opened. Detective Kowalski came in first. Then Barnes. Then a uniformed officer I did not recognize, which was deliberate. An unfamiliar face is harder to read, harder to negotiate with, harder to perform for. Kowalski said what she needed to say. The words were formal and procedural, and I had heard variations of them hundreds of times from the other side of the room. Vivian stood. She did not look at me. She walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. "Did Aaron talk?" she said. She was not looking at anyone in particular. She was asking the room. But the room's answer was already visible in the presence of 3 law enforcement officers and a hearing aid in a Ziploc bag, and a photograph with 4 words written in coral red lipstick. She walked out. I picked up the photograph. I picked up the wallet. I left the hearing aid on the table for Kowalski. I sat back down in the empty room and stayed there for 4 minutes, which is how long it took for the particular silence to become something I could stand up and carry. Kowalski called the full team at 5:22 p.m. By the time I arrived at the 3rd-floor conference room of Carolina's Medical Center, Daniel Cho had already set up the playback equipment. A laptop, 2 external speakers, and a printed transcript of both recordings that he had typed himself from the audio, time-stamped to the second. He had done this without being asked, which told me he understood what was in those files. Barnes was there. James Calloway, who had driven from his office without stopping for dinner. Marcus Reed, who had brought coffee for everyone except himself. Detective James Calloway, Detective Marcus Reed, had placed the Ziploc bag in the center of the table, and it sat there the way significant objects sit when everyone in the room knows what is inside them. Kowalski introduced the session simply. Evidence review, June 14th investigation, Whitfield case. She did not say attempted murder yet. She did not need to. Daniel Cho played the June 3rd recording first. 9 minutes and 17 seconds. The room listened the way rooms listen when what they are hearing is worse than what they expected. Nobody moved. Nobody wrote anything for the first 4 minutes. Then, gradually, pens began to move. Not because anyone had decided to take notes, but because having something to do with your hands makes it possible to keep listening. Vivian's voice filled the room with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, or something very close to it. The compound, the dosage, the 6-week window, the therapeutic ceiling, the 2 research papers cited by title, Aaron's quiet, reluctant confirmations, the sounds of a man who has agreed to something, and is now simply narrating his own compliance. 2 to 3 weeks if the dosage stays consistent. We have to be patient. Marcus set his pen down. It's the kindest way, Aaron. She won't feel it until it's already done. Nobody looked at each other. That is what I remember most clearly about those 9 minutes. Not what was said, but the quality of the silence between the people listening. 8 people in a room, and not one of them looked at another. Because sometimes what you are hearing requires your full attention, and there is nothing you can say to the person beside you that would not be smaller than what you are hearing. The recording ended. Cho moved his cursor to the second file. The June 14th recording lasted 2 minutes and 4 seconds. He played it twice because Kowalski asked him to. Vivian's voice, alone. The night garden. The particular silence of an outdoor space after midnight. No traffic, no wind, only the ambient texture of a Charlotte summer at the edge of quiet. It's done. 4 seconds of silence. Lord, we give thanks for what has been resolved. We ask for peace in what follows. Amen. The second time it played, I watched the room. Barnes had stopped writing. His hand was flat on the table, pen beside it, the way a hand comes to rest when it has processed something it will not forget. Marcus was looking at a point on the wall approximately 18 inches above the laptop screen, the particular focus of a man who is listening to something and simultaneously deciding what it means for the work ahead. James Calloway had both hands around his coffee cup, which had been empty for 20 minutes. Cho stopped the playback. Kowalski said, "Metadata." Cho pulled up the technical report. GPS coordinates confirmed within 12 feet of the Briarwood East Garden wall. Timelines consistent with Helen Marsh's dated notebook entries. No evidence of digital alteration across any of the 4 files. The device's scene detection log showed ambient volume exceeding the recording threshold at each timestamp, meaning the hearing aid had activated automatically, without Helen pressing anything, without Helen knowing in real time what it was capturing. "Chain of custody?" Kowalski asked. "Ziploc bag, Helen Marsh's kitchen table to this room," Cho said. "I documented the transfer at 9:17 this morning. No breaks." Kowalski looked at me. "North Carolina one-party consent." "Confirmed," I said. "Private citizen, shared property line. No warrant required. The recordings are admissible." Barnes wrote something on his pad, underlined it twice. At 6:17 p.m., Patricia Vane arrived. She had driven from Raleigh in 3 hours and 40 minutes, which meant she had left within 20 minutes of James's call. She was 61 years old, a former state prosecutor who had spent the last 14 years on the other side. And she had the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have heard a great deal of evidence and learned to identify immediately what will and will not hold. She did not sit down. She stood at the table, accepted the transcript from Cho, and read it while the rest of us stayed quiet. She read it once through without stopping. Then she turned back to the beginning and read certain sections again. The dosage passages, the therapeutic ceiling reference, the June 14th recording in full. She set the transcript down. "The prayer," she said. "Yes," I said. "That is the most damaging single element in this file." "I know." "A jury will remember that for the rest of their lives." She picked up the transcript again and turned to the second page, where Cho had noted the GPS coordinates and the chain of custody log. She studied it for 40 seconds. "Defense will challenge the hearing aid's recording function," she said. "They will argue the device was not designed for surveillance, that the activation was accidental, that the metadata could have been. The device manufacturer has a published technical manual confirming the ambient threshold activation, Cho said. I pulled it this afternoon. The recording function is a documented feature, not an anomaly. Vane looked at him. Good, she said. It was the highest compliment she was likely to give. She put the transcript in her bag. You have enough for a warrant tonight. You have enough for an indictment. Whether you have enough for a conviction depends on what Aaron Prescott decides to do in the next 72 hours. Kowalski nodded. We're moving on the warrant at 7. Get Prescott before he gets a lawyer he trusts, Vane said. He's the weakest point in the structure, and he knows it. The moment he understands his exposure, he will look for a door. She picked up her bag. She looked at me. She forgot, Vane said, that some conversations get recorded. I said that this morning, I told her. It's still true, she said, and left. I went to Margaret's room at 8:45 p.m. The monitors were steady. Her breathing was regular. The room had the particular quiet of medical machinery doing its work without drama, the quiet of things holding. I sat in the chair beside her bed. I took the old brown leather wallet from my jacket pocket. I held it in both hands for a moment. Its weight, its worn corners, the lifted inner lining where the ring had been. Then I set it gently on the edge of her blanket, near her hand. Not as evidence, not as a symbol, as a way of saying, I found what you left for me. I followed where it pointed. We are almost there. The monitors kept their rhythm. Outside, Kowalski was filing for a warrant. Inside, the room held us both. Margaret in the bed, me in the chair, the wallet between us. And I stayed until the quiet became the kind I could carry home. Marcus called at 7:14 a.m. I had been awake since 5, sitting at the small kitchen table in the rented apartment with the evidence log open in front of me and a cup of coffee I had stopped tasting an hour earlier. The apartment smelled of someone else's life, a faint residue of a different family's meals, a different family's mornings. And I had found, over the past several days, that I did not mind it. There was something honest about temporary spaces. They did not ask you to pretend you were home. Aaron filed a substitution of counsel at 6:48, Marcus said. Douglas Webb, criminal defense, Charlotte. 4 conspiracy cases in the last 8 years. 2 resulted in plea agreements. How long after filing did Webb request the evidence log? 3 minutes. I set the coffee down. A man does not hire Douglas Webb and request the evidence log 3 minutes later, unless he has already read the exposure calculation and found the number unacceptable. Aaron Prescott, former associate, former recipient of my professional intervention in a 2013 securities matter, had spent the night doing arithmetic. The arithmetic had told him what 25 years to life looks like when you are 52 years old. He's looking for a door, I said. Webb's already calling it cooperation, Marcus said. At 8:30 a.m., I met James Calloway in the hospital cafeteria. The room smelled of industrial coffee and reheated eggs, and the particular antiseptic undertone that seeps into everything within 3 floors of an ICU. A smell I had been carrying on my own jacket for days without noticing, until I sat down in an enclosed space and it announced itself. James had ordered nothing. He sat with his hands around an empty cup, which was unusual for a man who normally moved through every room as if he had somewhere more important to be. Dr. Anita Reeves found us at 8:47. Cardiac rhythm has been stable for 18 hours, she said. Digoxin levels are declining on schedule. Neurological outcome is still pending imaging, but the overnight indicators are better than we expected 48 hours ago. James looked at me. She's fighting, I said. She was always going to fight, Dr. Reeves said, with the quiet confidence of someone who has watched enough people in ICU beds to know the difference between a body that is surrendering and a body that is not. The question was always the timeline. At 11:43 a.m., Kowalski called. "Webb met with the DA this morning," she said. "They're moving fast. Proposed terms: Aaron pleads guilty to second-degree conspiracy. Recommended sentence: 10 years, parole eligible at 7. In exchange, full testimony against Vivian Whitfield, corroboration of the June 3rd and June 14th recordings, and a complete timeline of the planning phase from February through June." I said nothing for a moment. 7 years. A man who had sat in Helen Marsh's garden and agreed to the dosage of a compound designed to kill my wife, who had confirmed the timeline with the measured compliance of someone choosing profit over conscience. 7 years, and he would be 60 years old when he walked out. "Robert," Kowalski said, "I heard you." It's the standard cooperation reduction. Without his testimony, the recordings establish planning and execution, but the defense will argue Vivian acted alone and Aaron had no knowledge of. I understand the legal argument. Do you want to hear what else Webb offered? I did not particularly want to hear anything else Webb offered, but I said yes. "Aaron told Webb something that Webb passed to the DA this morning," Kowalski said. "He said he wanted it on record. He said—" She paused, and I could hear her reading directly from a document. "Vivian looked at me in the garden on the night of June 3rd with an expression that communicated clearly that if I did not participate, the next problem she needed to solve would be me." The cafeteria noise continued around me. Silverware, low voices, the institutional hum of a building that does not stop for anything. "He was afraid of her," I said. "He said he was more afraid of her than of the police," Kowalski said. "He said he needed that on record. I think he believed it would make him sympathetic." I thought about that for a moment. A man who had watched my wife's daughter plan a murder and had said almost nothing for 6 weeks because he was afraid of what Vivian would do if he refused. A man who had performed his compliance quietly, in the garden, in the dark, and had told himself the fear made it different from a choice. It did not make it different from a choice. Fear is not innocence. Aaron Prescott had not been dragged into that garden. He had walked there, and he had listened, and he had said yes in the register of a man who understood exactly what he was agreeing to. The cowardice of the follower is not a lesser crime than the cruelty of the leader. It is a different one, and in some ways it is the more corrosive one, because it is the cowardice that makes the cruelty possible. Every act of evil has a Vivienne. It also always has an Aaron. And without the Aaron, the Vivienne is simply a person with a plan. "Schedule the agreement for 2 p.m., I said. Detective Barnes set the cooperation document on the table at 2:04 p.m. 4 pages, standard formatting. Aaron Prescott's name at the top, Douglas Webb's signature on the 3rd page, the DA's office seal on the 4th. I read it the way I had read 10,000 documents, methodically, without expression, noting the language that would hold in court and the language that would be tested. It held. It was clean work. I resented that it was clean work. Barnes handed me a pen. It was a cheap pen, the kind kept in a cup on a government desk, the kind that has written 10,000 signatures on 10,000 forms and carries no particular weight in itself. I held it for a moment before I put it to paper. I had signed documents in every configuration that the law requires. Settlements that protected the guilty. agreements that reduced the culpable to the merely negligent, negotiations that converted 20 years into 8 because the alternative was a trial that might end in 3. I had held pens in all of those moments, and I had signed, because I understood that the law is not a system of perfect outcomes. It is a system of best available ones. But I had never, in 22 years, signed a document that gave partial freedom to a man who had helped plan my wife's death. The pen felt like a compromise of something I did not have a clean word for. Not justice. I had stopped believing in justice as a pure concept sometime around my 8th year of practice. Something older. Something closer to the part of a person that precedes their legal education and simply knows the difference between what happened and what the paperwork says happened. I signed. I put the pen down. I did not look at it again. I went to Margaret's room at 4:15 p.m. I sat in the chair beside her bed as I had sat every evening. I took the wallet from my pocket. I held it in both hands. Its worn leather, its lifted lining, the weight of what it had carried, and what it had been asked to carry since. I told her everything. Not the legal version, not the evidence log, not the chain of custody, not the cooperation agreement. I told her the true version, which is the version that includes the things that do not appear in documents. The cafeteria coffee that tasted of ash when Kowalski told me what Aaron had said about the garden. The pen that felt wrong in my hand. The 7 years that the law had decided was the appropriate exchange for what he had done. I told her about the photograph. I told her about Helen and the hearing aid and the 9 minutes and 17 seconds on June 3rd. I told her I had followed every thread she had laid down before she drove to Charlotte, and that every one of them had held. I told her it was done. The monitors kept their rhythm. And then Margaret's hand moved. Not a significant movement, not the kind that brings nurses into the room. A single, slow closure of the fingers nearest to mine. 1 second, perhaps a fraction longer, and then stillness again. And then, 2 seconds after the stillness, a breath. Longer than the ones before it. A breath that came from somewhere deeper than the mechanical rhythm of the last 9 days. The breath of a person who has been listening and has found the moment to answer. I did not call anyone. I sat with my hand near hers and the wallet in my lap and the monitors steady around us, and I understood that she had heard me, and that this, her hand, her breath, this particular quality of stillness, was the only closing argument she needed to make. Aaron James Prescott took the stand on a Tuesday morning in October. He was 52 years old, and he looked, in the gray suit Douglas Webb had chosen for him, like a man who had spent the last 4 months trying to become someone a jury could feel something other than contempt for. The suit was correct. The haircut was correct. The folder of documents Webb had placed on the defense table was correct. None of it changed what was in the recordings, but it was the right preparation for a man whose only remaining asset was the appearance of remorse. I sat in the second row of the gallery, beside James Calloway, and watched him walk to the stand. He did not look at Vivian. That was the first thing I noticed. In 22 years of courtrooms, I had watched a great many witnesses take their oath and arrange themselves in the chair. And the first thing most of them do, consciously or not, is locate the person their testimony will most affect. Aaron Prescott located the exit signs. He located the stenographer. He located ADA Claire Nguyen's table, and Douglas Webb's face in the gallery, and the water glass on the rail beside him. He did not, at any point in the walk from the gallery door to the witness chair, look at Vivian Whitfield, which told me everything about what he had seen in that garden on the night of June 3rd. The courtroom carried its own particular atmosphere that morning. The smell of old oak and circulated air, and, faintly, the antiseptic residue still present on my jacket from the weeks of hospital visits. The ceiling fan above the gallery turned at its slow metronomic pace, marking time the way ceiling fans in courtrooms always seem to, indifferent to what is being said below them. The court reporter's fingers moved at the edges of my peripheral vision. A constant, quiet rustling, like the turning of pages in a room where everyone else has stopped breathing. ADA Claire Nguyen opened at 9:07 a.m. She was methodical in the way that experienced prosecutors are methodical. Not dramatic, not performative, but precise. She established Aaron's relationship with Vivian Whitfield. She established the timeline. February conversation, March research phase, April acquisition of compounds, May dosage calibration, June administration. She established the financial motive, the $340,000 debt, the foreclosure proceedings, the $1.8 million life insurance policy naming Vivienne as sole beneficiary. Aaron confirmed each element in the flat, cooperative voice of a man who has practiced his testimony until the edges of genuine feeling have been smoothed away. He was not lying. The recordings made lying impractical. But he was narrating. He was constructing a version of events in which he was a man who had been afraid, who had been coerced, who had looked into the face of someone dangerous and made the terrible, human, understandable choice to comply rather than resist. I watched him do it and felt the particular contempt that belongs to courtrooms. Colder than anger, more durable. Aaron Prescott was not a victim of Vivian Whitfield. He was her accomplice. And the difference between those two things is not the presence or absence of fear. It is the presence or absence of a choice. Aaron had choices. He had choices in February, when Vivian first spoke in the kitchen. He had choices in March and April and May. He had the choice on the night of June 3rd to walk back through the garden door and call the police. He had chosen, at each of those moments, the option that preserved his mortgage and his debt relief and his continued association with a woman he understood to be dangerous. Fear is not innocence. The cowardice of the follower is not a lesser crime than the cruelty of the leader. Without Aaron's quiet compliance, Vivian's plan was only a plan. I did not write any of this down. I simply watched him narrate his cowardice as tragedy, and I let the contempt sit where it needed to sit. At 10:34 a.m., Nguyen said, "Your Honor, the people move to admit State's Exhibit 14. Judge Patricia Okafor nodded. "Admitted." Nguyen turned to Daniel Cho at the technical table. "Please play the recording." The courtroom went still in the specific way that courtrooms go still when everyone present understands they are about to hear something that cannot be unheard. The ceiling fan continued its rotation. The court reporter's hands came to rest. In the gallery, 12 jurors arranged themselves with the particular stillness of people who have been told to listen and have decided to do exactly that. Vivian's voice filled the room. 2 to 3 weeks if the dosage stays consistent. We have to be patient. I watched the gallery. I watched the jury box. I watched the woman in seat 4, a retired principal in her early 60s, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, yellow legal pad on her knee, begin to write in the rapid, deliberate strokes of someone who has identified the most important thing in the room. The recording continued. The compound. The therapeutic ceiling. Aaron's quiet confirmations. And then, "It's the kindest way, Aaron. She won't feel it until it's already done." The woman in seat 4 underlined something twice. The recording moved toward its end. The garden sounds. The night silence. And then Vivian's voice, alone, stripped of the procedural rhythm of the earlier section. It's done. The pause. 4 seconds of recorded Charlotte night. Lord, we give thanks for what has been resolved. We ask for peace in what follows. Amen. The word amen settled into the courtroom the way certain words settle. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a permanence that the surrounding air seems to absorb and hold. For a full 3 seconds after Cho stopped the playback, nobody moved. Nobody wrote. The ceiling fan turned. Then the court reporter's fingers resumed their quiet work, and I heard, from somewhere in the jury box, the sound of a pen being uncapped. I looked at Vivienne. She was sitting with her hands folded on the defense table, her posture correct, her expression arranged in the composed, slightly wounded register she had been maintaining since the trial began. The blazer, the pearls, the performance. But as the word amen had landed, something had happened at the right side of her neck. A single tendon, visible for perhaps 2 seconds, tightening beneath the skin before releasing. And her right hand, which had been resting open on the table, had closed around her pen with a pressure that turned the knuckle of her index finger briefly, unmistakably white. 3 seconds. Then the hand opened. Then the composure resumed. She had not made a sound. She had not changed her expression. But the pen had paid for it. Patricia Vane's cross-examination lasted 91 minutes. She was skilled, and she used every instrument available to her. A 2-day discrepancy in the March acquisition records. A gap in the communication log between Aaron and Vivian during April. The absence of a direct witness to the actual administration of the compounds. She established doubt where doubt could be established. She worked methodically and without visible frustration, which is the mark of a defense attorney who understands that the goal is not to win today, but to accumulate uncertainty across the full arc of the trial. It was good work. It did not touch the recording. It did not touch the prayer. Aaron's core testimony remained intact when Vane sat down at 12:03 p.m. The judge called a recess. The arraignment had happened 3 weeks earlier, on a gray Tuesday morning in courtroom 7 of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. I am placing it here because it belongs here, because the formal reading of the charges and the formal entry of the plea are the procedural hinge on which everything else turns, and I want you to understand the sequence as I experienced it. First, the trap, then the evidence, then Aaron's decision, and then, finally, the moment the state put its language around what Vivian had done. Judge Patricia Okafor read the charges in the measured cadence of someone who has read charges many times and understands that precision is its own form of gravity. Attempted murder in the first degree. Conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. Administering poison with intent to kill. Vivian stood beside Patricia Vane and entered her plea in a clear, uninfluenced voice. Not guilty. Bail was denied. Trial date set for October 14th. Vivian was remanded to Mecklenburg County Detention Center. I had arrived that morning with Margaret's teacup still on the kitchen counter, a coral red lipstick mark on the rim that I had not wiped away, because wiping it away felt like removing something that should stay. I had looked at it before I left the apartment, and I had thought about the worn-down lipstick tip and the 4 words on the back of a photograph and the lifted lining of an old leather wallet. I sat in the 3rd row of the gallery. Vivian, escorted to the defense table, did not look at the gallery. She walked with the particular, controlled evenness of a person who has decided that every movement in this room will be a performance of composure. The blazer, the pearls, the folded hands. She was let out after the proceeding ended. At the door, her stride changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that anyone who was not specifically watching her feet would have noticed. But at the exact point where she passed the third row of the gallery, her right foot came down a fraction of a second later than her pace had established. A single disrupted beat. A rhythm interrupted and immediately recovered. She did not turn her head. She did not look at me. But she had known exactly where I was. I stayed in my seat after the room emptied. The bailiff, Marcus, 31 years on the job, a man who has seen enough courtrooms to carry their weight lightly, came and stood near the door without rushing me. After a few minutes, I stood up. "I need to go see my wife," I said. He nodded and held the door. October 14th arrived the way significant days often arrive. Quietly, without announcement, in the specific gray of an early morning that does not yet know what it will be asked to carry. I woke at 6 a.m. in the rented apartment. Margaret was already at the kitchen table. She had been discharged 9 days earlier, and she had adapted to the apartment with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understands that home is not a place, but a practice. She had found the good light in the mornings, the east-facing window above the sink, and she had established her reading chair and her teacup and her particular arrangement of the things she needed within reach. And she had done all of this without making it a production, which was the most Margaret thing about her. I kissed her before I left. She said, "Come home after." I said I would. Courtroom 4 of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse occupied the third floor of a building that smelled, in its lobbies and stairwells, of old carpet and institutional wood polish. The smell of a place that processes significant events so regularly that significance has become its ambient condition. The courtroom itself was larger than Courtroom 7, where the arraignment had taken place, with higher ceilings and longer gallery benches, and a set of tall windows along the south wall that let in the kind of flat October light that neither flatters nor distorts. I arrived at 8:15 a.m. James Calloway was already in the second row, 2 cups of coffee on the bench beside him. Marcus Reed was standing near the gallery entrance, talking quietly with a younger detective I did not recognize. The jury filed in at 8:48 a.m. 12 people. I had studied the selection process, the way I had studied jury pools, for 22 years. Not looking for sympathy, but looking for structure. Who listens and who performs listening? Who takes notes and who trusts memory? Who will anchor the deliberation room and who will follow? Seat 4. She settled into her chair with the particular deliberateness of someone who has come prepared. Early 60s. Reading glasses on a cord around her neck. A yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil that she placed parallel to the pad's edge before the session began. A retired principal, the voir dire had established. 31 years, middle school, Charlotte Mecklenburg District. I had watched her during selection. She asked 2 clarifying questions when the judge explained the burden of proof, not because she did not understand it, but because she wanted to be certain she understood it correctly. That is the mark of a person who will hold the deliberation room to a standard rather than a feeling. She would matter. Ada Claire Nguyen rose at 9:03 a.m. She was wearing a charcoal suit, and she carried nothing to the podium except a single index card, which she glanced at once and did not look at again. She had been a prosecutor for 11 years, and she had the quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned to make a jury feel that what they are about to hear is not a case, but a truth that was always going to arrive at this room. She stood at the podium for 3 full seconds before she spoke. The silence was not accidental. It was the kind of silence that a skilled opening creates, the kind that asks the room to stop and recognize that something important is beginning. Then, on the night of June 14th, Margaret Whitfield was poisoned. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She outlined the compound, digoxin and warfarin, administered cumulatively across 6 weeks, and the effect. A cardiac event designed to appear natural, timed to resolve before medical intervention could establish cause. She named the defendant. She named Aaron Prescott. She named the financial motive with the specificity of numbers. $340,000 in outstanding debt. A $1.8 million life insurance policy. A mortgage 4 payments from foreclosure. She said, "The evidence in this case is not circumstantial. It is recorded. It is time-stamped. It is located within 12 feet of the defendant's property. And it ends," she paused, "with a prayer." The woman in seat 4 wrote something on her legal pad. The mechanical pencil moved with the precise, considered strokes of someone who has identified the load-bearing element of a structure and is noting it for later. Dr. Anita Reeves took the stand at 10:11 a.m. She had been Margaret's attending physician at Carolina's Medical Center, and she testified with the particular authority of someone who has converted a medical crisis into data and is now presenting the data to people who need to understand what the data means. Digoxin level on admission, 4.2 nanograms per milliliter. She paused to let the number register. The therapeutic ceiling is 2.0. The level we found in Mrs. Whitfield's bloodstream was more than twice the upper limit of safe treatment dosage. She moved to the second compound. Warfarin. INR on admission, 6.8. A safe therapeutic range is 2 to 3. At 6.8, the blood's clotting mechanism is severely compromised. Combined with elevated digoxin, the cardiac risk is not additive, it is exponential. She said the word cumulative 3 times in her testimony, each time in a slightly different context, which I recognized as deliberate, not repetitive, but progressive. She was building the concept of deliberate, sustained administration in the jury's understanding, layer by layer. It was at the moment she said, "The levels indicate repeated dosing over a period of weeks, not a single exposure," that it happened. From somewhere beyond the south-facing windows, distant, muffled by glass and October air, but present, the sound of an ambulance siren rose and passed and faded. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Dr. Reeves paused mid-sentence. The room paused with her. The woman in seat 4 looked up from her legal pad toward the window. Then she looked at the defendant's table. Then she wrote something, a single line, quickly, and underlined it. I did not need to see what she had written. The siren had said it without words. A body in a vehicle, moving fast toward a hospital, because someone had decided that a life was a problem to be resolved. Margaret had nearly been in that vehicle. Margaret had been in that vehicle 9 days before I found the lifted lining of an old leather wallet and drove north at 4 in the morning. Dr. Reeves continued her testimony. Patricia Vane's cross-examination of Dr. Reeves lasted 41 minutes. She challenged the specificity of the dosage timeline, questioned whether environmental factors could account for elevated INR levels, and introduced a published study suggesting digoxin sensitivity varies significantly across patient demographics. It was careful, methodical work. It introduced questions without answering them, which is the proper function of cross-examination. It did not touch the word cumulative. It did not touch the siren. The afternoon session opened at 1:47 p.m. with Gerald Park. Park was a forensic accountant. 58, gray suit, the kind of careful precision in speech that belongs to people who spend their professional lives making numbers tell stories to non-specialists. He had prepared 3 exhibits: Aaron Prescott's debt ledger, the mortgage foreclosure timeline, and the life insurance policy documentation. He walked the jury through each. $340,000 in outstanding debt across 6 creditors. Mortgage payments missed beginning in February, the same month Aaron and Vivian had their first kitchen conversation. Foreclosure proceedings initiated 8 weeks before Margaret's cardiac event. And the life insurance policy. $1.8 million. Single beneficiary. Vivian Elaine Whitfield. Effective date 12 years prior. Never amended. The woman in seat 4 was writing continuously. She had filled 2 pages of her legal pad. I watched her flip to a third, place the mechanical pencil parallel to the top edge in the brief pause between Park's exhibits, then pick it up again immediately when the next document appeared on the display screen. At 3:15 p.m., she drew a box around something on page 3. At 3:22 p.m., she drew a second box inside the first. I had seen this once before. A juror in a civil fraud case, 2009, who had done something similar with a financial timeline. She had been the foreperson. The plaintiff had won. Court adjourned at 4:55 p.m. I walked to the parking structure on 6th Street, sat in the car for a few minutes without starting the engine, and called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. "How was it?" she said. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I thought about the siren, about the woman in seat 4 and her mechanical pencil, about Vivian's neck tendon during the June 3rd playback, and the pen held until the knuckle turned white. "It's moving the way it should move," I said. "Are you coming home?" "Yes." "I made soup." I started the engine. On the drive back, I thought about what Margaret had said during the arraignment week, when I had told her about Vivian's performance. The blazer, the pearls, the folded hands. "She's performing," Margaret had said. She had said it without bitterness and without surprise, which was the thing that stayed with me. Not that she had identified the performance, but that she had named it so quietly, as if she had always known that Vivian's composure was a construction, and had spent years watching it being built, and had understood, long before I did, what it was built to conceal. I drove south on I-77. The city receded in the rearview mirror. She's performing, I thought, and the jury is watching. The June 14th recording was played for the second time on the afternoon of October 17th. Nguyen had held it, deliberately, strategically, until the 3rd day of trial, after the financial evidence had settled into the jury's understanding and Aaron's testimony had established the planning timeline. She played it at 3:41 p.m., when the afternoon light through the south windows had shifted to the low, flat angle that makes everything in a courtroom look simultaneously more ordinary and more permanent. The room responded the same way it had responded in the conference room at Carolina's Medical Center, and the same way it would respond every time those 2 minutes and 4 seconds were played in any room that contained human beings who understood what they were hearing. It's done. The pause. Lord, we give thanks for what has been resolved. We ask for peace in what follows. Amen. The words settled. The woman in seat 4 did not write immediately. She sat with her mechanical pencil held loosely in her right hand, her eyes forward, for 11 seconds after the playback ended. Then she wrote a single line, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who is not summarizing, but recording. The way you write something down when you want to be certain you will be able to find it again. Vivian's right hand was palm down on the defense table. I counted. 11 seconds. Her hand rested flat against the wood, not gripping, not pressing, simply resting with the particular stillness of a person exerting a very large amount of effort to remain still. Then it lifted and returned to its folded position, and the composure resumed its architecture. 11 seconds of bare wood. It was the most honest thing she had done in 3 days of trial. Patricia Vane requested a recess at 3:47 p.m. Judge Okafor granted it until 9 a.m. the following day. I drove back to the apartment in the early evening, the city giving way to the quieter residential streets where the rented apartment sat between two houses whose inhabitants I had never met. Margaret had made soup again. She had been making soup with a regularity that I understood was not about soup, but about the maintenance of ordinary ritual, in a period when ordinary ritual was the most stabilizing thing available to either of us. We ate without discussing the trial. She asked about the light in the courtroom. I told her about the south windows and the flat October angle. She said it sounded like the light in the church on Sunday mornings, the way it comes in low and makes everything look like it has already been decided. I thought that was probably right. At 6:14 p.m., my phone rang. Patricia Vane. "She'll take the plea," Vane said. She said it the way attorneys say things they have known for some time and are now confirming. Not with surprise, but with the particular flatness of a professional delivering a conclusion they reached before they made the call. "All 3 counts?" I said. "All 3. No reduction. No negotiation on the charges." "Sentencing recommendation?" 18 to 22 years. Parole eligible at 15. I stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the street was quiet. A neighbor's porch light, a car moving slowly past, the ordinary texture of an evening that did not know what was being decided inside the apartment above it. "She came to you?" I said. "This afternoon, after the recess." A pause. She asked me if the jury had heard the prayer before today. I told her they had heard it in the first week from Aaron's testimony. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Arrange the meeting." I thought about that. A woman who had spent 4 months maintaining a performance so precise that it had survived arrest, arraignment, and 3 days of trial. Finally, asking a question whose answer told her what she already knew. Not the evidence, not the financial testimony, not even Aaron's voice confirming the plan. The prayer. The prayer had told her that the performance was over. "When?" I said. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, before the session would have resumed." I looked at the soup bowl Margaret had left on the counter, the coral red lipstick mark on the rim of her teacup. Present, as it had been every morning since she came home, because I had not wiped it away, and she had not asked me to. "I'll be there," I said. The morning of October 18th was overcast. I arrived at courtroom 4 at 8:15 a.m. Marcus Reed was in the gallery. James Calloway was seated in the second row with a legal pad he would not need. The DA's team was at their table. Patricia Vane was already at the defense table, a single folder in front of her, her hands folded on top of it. Vivienne was brought in at 8:43 a.m. She was wearing the charcoal gray blazer, not the black one, the charcoal, which was slightly less formal, slightly less constructed than the arraignment outfit. I noticed this the way I notice everything in a room where I have been trained to notice everything, and I thought, she has chosen, this morning, to be slightly less armored. Whether that was strategic or genuine, I could not determine, and I found that I no longer needed to. She sat beside Vane without looking at the gallery. Judge Okafor entered at 8:51 a.m. She read the terms of the agreement into the record. Guilty plea on all 3 counts. Attempted murder in the first degree. Conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. Administering poison with intent to kill. Sentencing recommendation of 18 to 22 years. Parole eligibility at 15. The plea was voluntary, entered without coercion, acknowledged by both the defendant and her counsel. The judge looked at Vivienne. How do you plead to the charge of attempted murder in the first degree? Vivienne's voice was clear. Guilty. How do you plead to the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree? Guilty. The word was the same word, the same volume, the same cadence, the same composed delivery. But the second one carried something the first had not. A weight that had accumulated in the silence between them. The weight of a word said once, becoming the weight of a decision confirmed. How do you plead to the charge of administering poison with intent to kill? The third pause was longer than the first 2. Not dramatically long, not the pause of a person reconsidering. The pause of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and is now, in this specific room, on this specific morning, setting it down. Guilty. Judge Okafor remanded Vivienne to custody pending sentencing, scheduled for November 18th. Vane gathered her folder. The DA's team began organizing their materials. The court reporter's fingers stilled. Marcus was making a notation in his pad. James Calloway had his hands around his coffee cup, which was, as it had been at the hospital cafeteria, already empty. Vivienne stood. The officer at the door moved to escort her out. She walked toward the door with the same controlled evenness she had maintained throughout, the same deliberate placement of each step, the same architecture of composure that had been her defining performance for 4 months. The blazer, the posture, the folded hands now at her sides. At the defense table, where she had sat for 3 days, she had left her pen. It was a slender black ballpoint, the kind that comes in a set, nothing distinctive. I noticed it when the officer moved to escort her, because it was the only object remaining on the defense table, isolated in the center of the clean surface. I looked more closely. The clip was gone. Not lost, gone. Snapped clean from the barrel, the way a clip snaps when it has been subjected to sustained, repeated lateral pressure. The kind of pressure a hand applies when it needs something to do that is not visible to a jury. The kind of pressure that accumulates across 3 days of sitting still and appearing composed while evidence you cannot answer is entered into the record. The clip had been intact on day 1. I had noticed it when she set the pen down after taking notes during Nguyen's opening. At some point in the 72 hours between Nguyen's first sentence and the third, guilty, the clip had been subjected to enough sustained force to separate it from the barrel. The composure had held. The pen had paid for it. I did not leave immediately. I sat in the second row after the room had emptied. Marcus at the door, James in the corridor, the DA's team gone. Vane already on her phone in the hallway. The courtroom held its post-proceeding quiet, the particular silence of a room that has absorbed something significant, and is now simply a room again, indifferent and still. I took the old brown leather wallet from my jacket pocket. I held it for a moment, its worn corners, its lifted lining, the weight of what it had carried and what it no longer needed to carry. Then I put it back. I called James at 9:47 a.m. "It's done," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Which kinda done?" I thought about that. The kind of done that is also a beginning. The kind of done that leaves you sitting in a courtroom, holding an old wallet, and thinking about a cup of tea with a lipstick mark on the rim, and a woman at an east-facing window who has made the apartment into something that functions like home. The kind that lets you go home, I said. He said, then go. That evening I returned to the apartment before Margaret had finished her tea. She was at the kitchen table with her book open, the east window behind her, the late October light doing what late October light does in the late afternoon, coming in low and finding every surface that will hold it. I sat across from her. I did not tell her immediately. I let the room be the room for a moment, the tea, the book, the light, the coral red mark on the rim of her cup. Then I reached into my jacket pocket. The ring had been returned to us 2 weeks earlier, after the evidence log was formally closed. The white gold band that Margaret had hidden in the wallet's inner pocket before she drove to Charlotte. The ring that had traveled from her finger to the leather to my pocket to a police evidence bag and back again, carrying its meaning through every iteration of the last 4 months. I took her left hand. I slid the ring back onto her finger. She watched me do it without speaking. The light caught it, a small, clean flash of white gold in the October afternoon. And then it was simply there, where it had always been, where it would stay. It's done, I said. Margaret looked at the ring for a moment. Then she looked at me. I know, she said. She turned back to her book. I made tea. If you have stayed with me this far, through the drive on I-77, the wallet, the hospital room, the hearing aid, the photograph, the 3 recordings, the pen that paid for the composure, leave a 1 in the comments so I know you are still here. I want to be honest with you. What follows contains details I have reconstructed and, in places, fictionalized. Names, timelines, certain conversations. To protect people who are still living their lives on the other side of this. If that matters to you, you can stop here. The truth of what happened is in the ring. And the ring is back where it belongs. If you want to continue, I will see you in the next one. November 18th was a gray morning. I drove to the Mecklenburg County Courthouse alone. Margaret had offered to come. I told her I would rather she didn't, and she accepted this without argument. She understood what I was protecting her from. Not the verdict, which was already settled. The experience of sitting in a room and watching your daughter receive a number that will define the next 2 decades of her life. Some things a person should be allowed to absorb before sharing. She pressed her hand to my chest before I left. I covered it with mine for a moment. Then I went. ADA Nguyen presented the sentencing recommendation at 9:14 a.m. 18 to 22 years, parole eligible at 15. Patricia Vane offered 3 mitigating factors: no prior criminal record, demonstrated professional achievement, and what she carefully termed a history of psychological pressure within the family structure. Judge Okafor received them with 4 seconds of silence. Then she looked at Vivienne. 20 years. Parole eligibility at 17. Before the sentence was read, Judge Okafor asked if the victim's family wished to make a statement. I had written 4 sentences on a legal pad 3 nights earlier. Correct sentences, precise and measured, the kind a 22-year litigator produces when asked to summarize loss in 3 minutes. I had read them back to myself twice and known they were right and known they were not enough, and left the pad on the kitchen table. I stood up and walked to the podium without notes. The room was very quiet. I looked at the back wall for a moment, not at the judge, not at the jury, not at Vivienne. just the back wall. The way you look at something neutral when you need a second to find the true version of what you were about to say. Then I said, Margaret Whitfield has been my wife for 28 years. She packed a photograph and hid a ring, and drove to Charlotte knowing what she was driving toward. Because she believed truth has an obligation to be present, even when it is dangerous. The law will tell my daughter what she owes for what she did. It cannot tell me what I owe my wife for who she is. I am still working that out. I paused. That's all I have. James Calloway had his hand flat on the bench beside me when I sat back down. Not touching, just present. Vivian stood for the sentence correctly, as she had stood for everything in this courtroom. The charcoal blazer, her hands at her sides, the architecture of her composure intact to the last. When Judge Okafor finished, Vivian turned her head and looked at me. Not the performed look of the television segment, not the constructed composure of 4 months of trial. Something older than both of those things. It lasted 2 seconds, no more, and contained more genuine information than anything she had communicated since the morning Detective Kowalski had walked into room 416. I have spent 22 years reading faces in courtrooms. What I saw in those 2 seconds was not defiance. It was not contempt. It was not the cold calculation of someone already planning the appeal. It looked like grief. Then the bailiff moved between us, and she was gone. 3 days after the sentencing, Margaret told me over breakfast that she wanted to see the house before we went back to Charleston. Not to reclaim anything, simply to stand in the rooms and be finished with them. I drove her to Briarwood Court on a Thursday afternoon. The house was empty. Forensic cleaning completed, personal effects removed, the rooms returned to the neutral condition of a space between occupants. It smelled of cleaning solution and absence. Margaret moved through it quietly, touching things lightly. The way you move through a place you are saying goodbye to, rather than one you are leaving. She stood in the kitchen with her hand resting on the counter, looking at the window above the sink. The window that faced the east garden, Helen's fence line, the 12 feet of shared wall where 4 recordings had been made. She did not speak. She moved her hand slowly along the counter's edge, not measuring it, but remembering it. She stood in the bedroom doorway. She did not go in. She opened the back door and looked out at the east garden. November bare, the rose canes stripped and gray. Helen was already there. Standing near the wall in her cardigan, hands at her sides, as if she had simply been in the garden at the right moment. She and Margaret looked at each other across the cold November grass, the way 2 people look at each other when they have been through something together that does not have a clean name. Margaret walked across the garden. They stood together near the wall. I watched from the back door. At some point, Helen put her arms around Margaret, and Margaret leaned into it briefly. Then they separated and stood again in the quiet. I went back inside and found the photograph in the front hallway, face down on the windowsill, slightly dusty, overlooked in the cataloging. I turned it over. Vivian at the beach, 24 years old, laughing at something off camera. The back had been wiped clean. The 4 words in coral red lipstick were gone, the paper slightly abraded where they had been. The instruction had done its work. I put the photograph in my jacket pocket next to the wallet. We drove south on I-77 in the late afternoon. Margaret fell asleep somewhere around mile marker 60. Her left hand rested in her lap, the white gold ring catching the last of the November light at intervals, small, intermittent flashes as the highway moved beneath us. I watched it happen twice, 3 times, the ring doing what rings do in certain light, which is simply to remind you that they are there. The photograph was in my pocket. The wallet was in my pocket. The ring was on her finger, where it had always been, where it would stay. The roses at Briarwood were dormant. In 4 months they would bloom again, indifferent to what had happened in the garden above their roots, growing toward the available light because that is what they do, regardless of the history of the soil they are planted in. I thought Margaret would have something to say about that when she woke up. I was already looking forward to hearing it. I went to the church before Margaret woke up. It was a Sunday in late November, the sky still dark at 6:40 a.m. The streets between the apartment and First Baptist carrying the particular quiet of a city that has not yet decided to begin. I had a key. 17 years of membership produces certain small privileges, and I let myself in through the side door and sat in Margaret's pew in the empty sanctuary. The sanctuary held the cold in the way old buildings hold cold, not aggressively, but completely. The kind of cold that has settled into wood and stone over decades and does not leave simply because the heat comes on. I sat in it and did not mind it. It felt appropriate for what I had come to do, which was not pray exactly, but think in a space designed for honesty. I had been a litigator for 22 years. I had built cases from fragments, a lifted wallet lining, a hearing aid in a Ziploc bag, a photograph with 4 words pressed into its back. I had followed every thread Margaret had laid down before she drove to Charlotte, and every thread had held. And Vivienne was in Mecklenburg County Detention Center, and Aaron Prescott would begin his sentence in the spring, and the law had done what the law does. And yet I sat in the empty pew and felt the specific unease of a man who has won something and is not certain winning is the right word for it. Pastor William Gaines found me at 7:15 a.m. He was 63 years old and had been senior pastor for 19 years. And he had the quality of presence that belongs to people who have sat with a great many humans in a great many difficult moments and have learned that the most useful thing is usually to sit down and say less than you know. He sat beside me. We were quiet for a moment. "Helen Marsh has been praying for your family for 30 years, he said finally. "Did you know that?" I said I hadn't. She started when Margaret joined the congregation. She told me once she didn't know why. She simply felt, the first Sunday she saw Margaret, that here was a woman who was going to need it. He paused. "Helen's hearing aid recorded your daughter's conversation because Helen was in her garden at 7:41 on a June evening. Helen was in her garden because she gardens every evening. She gardens every evening because she has done so for 30 years. Another pause. At what point does that stop being coincidence? I thought about the GPS coordinates, 12 feet, the ambient threshold of a hearing aid's recording function, a retired neighbor's 30-year habit of evening gardening. I don't have a clean answer for that, I said. No, Gaines said. That's the kind that doesn't ask your permission. I drove to Charlotte the following Thursday. I had 3 winter bear rose canes wrapped in damp newspaper on the back seat. Cut from the Charleston garden that morning, roots intact, ready for transplanting. Margaret had suggested it. She had said it simply, over tea, without preamble. Take some of ours to Helen, for what she grew there. Helen opened the door before I knocked. We sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where I had first heard the June 3rd recording, where Daniel Cho had confirmed the metadata, where Kowalski had said, "We have enough for a warrant," and drank tea and talked for a long time about things that were not the case. At some point, Helen said, "Can I tell you something that happened in 1993? I said yes. I was in a grocery store in June of that year. A young woman ahead of me in the line dropped a baby sock, her child's, I assumed, from the basket. She didn't notice. I picked it up and touched her shoulder, and she turned around. Helen held her cup in both hands. She had a face that reminded me of someone I had loved and lost. And she smiled at me. Not a polite smile, a real one, the kind that costs something. And said thank you, and put the sock in her pocket. She looked at the window above her sink. I have thought about that smile for 30 years. I never knew her name. I never saw her again. But something about it stayed with me. The way certain things stay. Not because they are large, but because they arrive at the exact moment you needed them. She set her cup down. 3 months later, I moved to Briarwood Court. The house next door was empty. A year after that, a young couple moved in. The woman had a face that reminded me of the woman in the grocery store. A pause. It was Margaret. I sat with that. I don't know if they were the same person, Helen said. I have never asked. But something in me has always felt that the 30 years between that grocery store and the evening of June 3rd were not random. She looked at me directly. The hearing aid was just the last piece. I drove home in the late afternoon with the empty newspaper still on the back seat, the rose canes already in Helen's east garden, planted along the wall, facing south, positioned for the available light. On the way out of Charlotte, I stopped at a gas station and called Margaret. She told me a story, I said. A good one? I thought about 30 years. A baby sock, a smile that costs something, a face that stays. Yes, I said. A very good one. Helen called on a Saturday morning in December. Margaret answered. I was in the garden with a pair of pruning shears and the particular focused quiet that comes from having something useful to do with your hands. And I heard Margaret's voice through the open kitchen window. Not the words, just the tone, which shifted within the first 30 seconds from polite to something warmer and more careful. The way her voice shifts when she is receiving news that requires her full attention. I came inside. She was standing at the kitchen counter with the phone held in both hands, which is what she does when she is listening to something she wants to hold on to. Helen says the canes are establishing, she told me when she hung up. She checked them this morning. The root structure is holding in the soil. It's only been 2 weeks, I said. She knows that. Margaret set the phone down. She said she checks them every morning anyway. I thought about 30 years of evening gardening. Of course she checked them every morning. Helen had also said something else. Margaret relayed it carefully. The way she relays things she has already decided matter. Helen had gone back to the grocery store. Not the same store. It had closed years ago, a pharmacy in its place now, and stood on the sidewalk outside for a few minutes. She had not known exactly why she went. She said it felt like finishing a sentence she had started a long time ago. Margaret was quiet after she told me this. Then she said, I want to write to Vivienne. I did not respond immediately. I had known this was coming. Had known it since the empty house, since the kitchen counter, since the drive south on I-77 with the ring catching November light. Margaret does not arrive at decisions quickly, but once she arrives, she has usually been there for some time before she says it aloud. Okay, I said. Not about the trial. Not about what happened. She looked at the east window, the December light coming in low and flat. Just that we are still here, that the roses are planted, that I wanted her to know that. I thought about the photograph, the abraded paper where 4 words had been, the instruction that had done its work and left the surface clean for whatever came next. "Do you want help?" I said. "Not yet." A pause. "Maybe with the last line." She started the letter that afternoon. I did not read it. She sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pen, not the coral red lipstick, a regular pen, blue ink, and wrote in the quiet way she does most things, without visible struggle, as if the words had been waiting and she was simply giving them the paper they needed. I made tea and left it beside her and went back to the garden. An hour later she came to the back door and said, "I finished." I came in and she handed me the letter. 2 paragraphs, her handwriting, even and unhurried. The same handwriting that had pressed 4 words into the back of a photograph before driving to Charlotte. I read it once. Then I read the last line again. She had not needed my help with it after all. It was exactly right. Not forgiving in the way that asks for acknowledgement, not conditional on anything Vivian did or said or became in the next 17 years. The kind of forgiveness that is complete in the giving of it, that does not wait for a response to be true. I handed it back. "It's right," I said. She folded it and put it in an envelope and wrote Vivian's name on the front in the same even hand. She set it on the counter by the door. Not mailed yet, simply placed, the way you place something when it is ready, but you want to sit with the readiness for a little while. That evening I called Helen back. We talked for a long time. Longer than I expected. The way conversations go when the official subject has been resolved, and what remains is everything that surrounds it. We talked about Charleston and Charlotte, about the different quality of winter in each city, about her husband, who had died 11 years ago, about Margaret's recovery, which Helen asked about with the specific attention of someone who has been invested in the outcome for longer than the crisis itself. At some point she said, "Do you think the roses will bloom in spring?" "Yes," I said. "Both gardens." She was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. "I'd like that very much." After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a while. The envelope was on the counter by the door. The teacups were in the rack. Through the window the garden was dark, the rose canes invisible in the December night, but present, rooted, dormant, oriented toward a spring they had not yet reached. Margaret came in from the sitting room and stood beside me. She did not say anything. She looked at the envelope on the counter, then at the window. Then she picked up her teacup, the one with the coral red mark on the rim that I had never wiped away, and held it in both hands. We stood there together in the kitchen for a few minutes, which was enough. The Christmas wreath went up on the first Saturday of December. Margaret had kept it in a box on the top shelf of the hall closet for 11 years. The same wreath, repaired annually, a strand of dried eucalyptus replaced one year, a ribbon retied another. She brought it down and hung it on the front door, and stepped back and looked at it for a moment, then adjusted it a quarter turn to the left until it was exactly straight. I watched from the hallway. It was such a small thing, and it was not a small thing at all. We went to First Baptist together that Sunday. Pastor Gaines preached from a text about endurance. Not the dramatic endurance of extraordinary circumstances, but the ordinary kind. The endurance that shows up in repeated small acts. The habit maintained, the ritual observed, the wreath brought down from the shelf and hung and straightened. He said that the things which last are rarely the things that announce themselves. They are the things done quietly, again and again, in the available light. I thought about rose canes tied back to a fence. I thought about a coral red mark on a teacup rim, present every morning, unremarked upon, simply there. Margaret was sitting beside me with her hands in her lap and her ring catching the December light through the stained glass. A small, colored flash, amber and gold, different from the highway light and the kitchen light and the November light on I-77. But the same ring, the same finger, the same fact. I did not look away for a long time. James Calloway called on a Tuesday afternoon. He had news about the civil proceedings, documentation requirements, a timeline for the estate resolution, several items that required my attention before the end of the year. We worked through them methodically, the way James and I have always worked. Two people who have known each other long enough to move through necessary things without ceremony. At the end of the call, he said, "What are you going to do now?" I had been asked this question several times since the sentencing, by Marcus, by Gerald Simmons, by two former colleagues who had followed the case from a distance. Each time, I had given a version of the same answer, which was honest but incomplete. This time, I said, "I'm learning to be still." James was quiet for a moment. "That's harder than it sounds," he said. "Yes," I said, "it is." "Call me in the spring," he said, "when the roses bloom." On the Saturday before Christmas, I drove to the garden center and bought a spool of soft wire and a new pair of pruning shears. The old pair had served for 6 years and were still functional, but the handles had loosened, and I had been meaning to replace them since October and had simply not gotten around to it, which is the kind of thing that accumulates in a year like the one we had just moved through. I spent 40 minutes in the garden, tying the winter-loose rose canes back to the fence. It is careful work, not difficult, but requiring attention. Each cane has to be positioned so it faces the light it will grow toward in spring, secured firmly enough to hold through winter weather, but not so tightly that it cannot move. You are not constraining the plant. You are orienting it. There is a difference, and the difference matters. I worked through all 14 canes. When I finished, I stood back and looked at the fence. The canes tied at intervals, bare and gray, holding their winter positions. And I thought about what Patricia Vane had said in Helen's Kitchen in June. The structure is sound. She had meant the evidence, but structure is structure. I went inside when the light began to fail. Margaret was at the kitchen table with her book open, the east window behind her, the last of the December afternoon, coming in low and finding every surface that would hold it. Her teacup was beside her. The coral red mark on the rim was present, as it was every morning, every afternoon, every evening. Not a symbol anymore, simply a fact of the cup. The way certain marks become part of the object that carries them. I sat across from her with my tea and my newspaper and did not immediately read either. I watched her turn a page. Her left hand moved to the corner of the page. A small practiced motion. The motion of someone who has turned 10,000 pages in 10,000 quiet hours. And as her hand lifted, I saw the ring catch the December light. Not the colored light of the church window, not the highway flash of November, not the white gold brightness of the October kitchen. The flat, honest light of a December afternoon, which flatters nothing and obscures nothing, and simply shows what is there. The ring, her hand, the page turning. I held that for a moment, the whole year in it somehow. The wallet and the drive and the hospital and the hearing aid and the courtroom and the empty house and the letter on the counter by the door. All of it present in the texture of this moment, not as wound but as structure. The way scar tissue is not the absence of what was there before. It is what the body builds to remain intact. We were not who we had been in January. We were something that had been tested and had held. which is not the same as unchanged, but is, I was finding, enough. More than enough. It was enough. Margaret said she was ready on a Sunday morning in January. We had just finished washing the breakfast dishes, she washing, I drying, the ordinary choreography of a long marriage that requires no discussion to execute. When she set the last cup in the rack and dried her hands and said, "I want to write the letter today." I hung the dish towel on the rack. "Okay," I said. She went to the kitchen table. I made fresh tea and set a cup beside her and left her to it. She had a single sheet of paper and a pen, blue ink, not the coral red. I noticed this and understood it. The coral red had done its work. This was something different. This was not a message hidden in a photograph for someone else to find. This was a letter written in daylight, at a kitchen table, addressed directly to the person it was for. I sat in the sitting room with a book I did not read and listened to the particular silence of someone writing. The pause between sentences. The slight sound of the pen. Another pause. Margaret writes the way she does most things, without visible struggle, as if she has known what she wanted to say for some time and is simply now giving it the paper it needs. 20 minutes, perhaps 25. She came to the sitting room doorway and said, "I'm done." I put the book down. She handed me 2 paragraphs on a single sheet, her handwriting even and unhurried. I read it once through without stopping. Then I went back to the last line and read it again. She had written, "I do not need you to understand this yet. I only need you to know that it is already true." I held the letter for a moment. In 22 years of legal work, I had read a great many documents that attempted to resolve what exists between people. Settlements, agreements, orders, decrees. I had helped draft language intended to close what cannot fully be closed, to formalize what resists formalization. I had learned, over those years, that the law is precise and human feeling is not, and that the gap between them is where most of the real work happens. Margaret's last line lived entirely in that gap. It did not ask for acknowledgement. It did not wait for Vivian to become something different before it became true. It was simply and completely true in the moment of its writing, and it would remain true whether Vivian read it in a week or a year or never. That is the kind of forgiveness that has no legal equivalent. "It's right," I said. She took it back and folded it once and put it in the envelope she had already addressed. Vivian, in Margaret's even hand, no surname needed, and set it on the counter by the door. She looked at me then, with an expression I recognized but could not have named when we were younger. The expression of a person who has done something difficult and is on the other side of it, and is simply present in that fact. "Your turn," she said. I had not planned to write anything. I had told myself over the preceding weeks that Margaret's letter was sufficient, that whatever I needed to say to Vivian, I had said in the courtroom, in the room with the wallet and the hearing aid, in the 4 minutes of silence after she was escorted out. I had told myself that lawyers know when a case is closed. I sat down at the kitchen table. I took a sheet of paper and picked up the pen, blue ink, the same pen, and I wrote without stopping, which surprised me. 3 paragraphs. Not a legal document. Not the statement I had prepared and left on the table in November. Something else. The true version, which includes what does not appear in evidence logs. I wrote about the 2013 securities case, and the fact that I had introduced Aaron Prescott to her world. That my professional history had provided one of the instruments of what happened in that garden. I wrote that I did not know what to do with that yet, but that I was not going to pretend it was not true. I wrote about the beach photograph, the one James Calloway had found in Margaret's overnight bag. The girl laughing at something off camera, her shoulders loose, her whole body oriented toward whatever was making her laugh. I said I kept that photograph because it was true too, and because truth does not expire, and because whoever that girl was at that beach still exists somewhere inside the woman in Mecklenburg County Detention Center, and I was not willing to stop believing that. I wrote, I do not know what you will do with 17 years. I hope you will do something with it that the girl in the photograph would recognize. I put the pen down. Margaret was at the window, her back to me, looking at the January garden. The rose canes were visible against the fence, bare, tied, waiting. Can I add mine to the envelope? I said. She turned around. Yes, she said. I left room. I folded my letter and added it to hers and sealed the envelope. We mailed it that afternoon on the way back from a walk. Dropped it into the blue postal box on the corner of Rutledge and Broad, the one Margaret has passed 10,000 times in 28 years of Charleston mornings. She let go of the envelope. It disappeared into the slot. We walked home. The forsythia bloomed on the 14th of February. I know because I was in the garden when it happened. I had been outside since early morning with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, checking the rose canes the way I had been checking them since December. Not because they required daily attention, but because standing in the garden in the early morning had become, over that winter, my closest approximation of stillness. The canes were bare. The soil was cold. Nothing was happening in any visible way. Then I looked left, and the forsythia was yellow. Fully, completely yellow. The way forsythia blooms when it has decided that waiting is finished. It had not been yellow the previous morning. It was yellow now. I went inside and told Margaret. She came out in her coat and stood beside me and looked at it. There it is, she said. Helen called that afternoon. The forsythia is blooming, she said, before anything else. Ours too, I said, this morning. She asked about the roses. I told her the canes were showing green at the nodes, another few weeks. She said the same was true in Charlotte. She said she didn't mind the waiting. I told her I understood. There is a difference between waiting for something uncertain and waiting for something that has already decided to arrive. The green at the nodes was not a question. It was a quiet announcement. We talked about the letter. I told her we had mailed it in January and had not yet received a response, and that we were at peace with whatever came next. The waiting for that is different, Helen said. Yes, I said, but it's okay. Margaret was at the kitchen table when I came inside. Her book, her tea, the east window behind her. The tableau that had become, over the months since November, the image I associated most completely with the word home. The ring on her finger, as ordinary and present as it had always been before this year, made it remarkable, and was now again. I sat across from her. She turned a page. Then she looked up and saw me looking at her. What? She said. Nothing, I said. She returned to her book. I looked past her at the empty chair beside the window, the one that had always been Vivienne's when she visited, angled toward the garden, catching the morning light. It was empty now in a different way than chairs are usually empty. It held the specific absence of a person who is alive and present in your thoughts, and unavailable to sit in it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Margaret, her hand on the page, the ring catching the February light. And something in me that had been holding a particular tension since June quietly released it. Not resolved, not finished, simply set down. The way you set down something heavy, not because you have decided it doesn't matter, but because your arms have learned, finally, that carrying it is optional. I almost smiled. Then I did. The first rose opened on the 4th of March. A single white bloom on the cane nearest the east fence, fully open by mid-morning, facing south. I photographed it and sent it to Helen. She responded in 4 minutes with her own photograph. A white bloom on the cane I had brought from Charleston, planted along her east wall, facing the same direction. 400 miles apart, the same roses. I showed Margaret. She looked at both photographs, then set the phone down and said, "Tell Helen we'll come in the spring." Helen responded, "I'll make room in the East Garden." I have been asked, in the month since the trial, what I would say to someone facing what I faced in June. I have not had a clean answer. What I have is this. Margaret packed the photograph and hid a ring, and drove to Charlotte because she believed, and I have turned this over in my mind so many times now that it is worn smooth, the way certain true things do, that truth has an obligation to be present, even when it is dangerous. She did not arrive at that belief in June. She had lived it for 28 years, quietly, without announcing it, the way she does most things that matter. I had watched her do it, and not always understood what I was watching. I understand now. Helen was in her East Garden on the evening of June 3rd because she had been in her East Garden every evening for 30 years. The truth was recorded because she was there. The forsythia bloomed on the 14th of February, the same as every year, indifferent to what the winter had contained. The things that hold are rarely the things that announce themselves. They are the ring returned to its finger, the letter mailed on a January afternoon, the rose cane tied back to the fence and oriented toward the light it has not yet reached. Truth has an obligation to be present even when it is dangerous. I will carry that sentence for the rest of my life, not as a verdict, as a compass. Margaret finished her tea. She closed her book, a finger marking her page, intending to return, and carried her cup to the sink. She rinsed it and set it in the rack, the coral red mark on the rim present as always, unremarkable, simply there. She paused at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden. "The roses are beautiful," she said. I looked at them with her. The white bloom on the east fence, the forsythia yellow behind it, the March light doing what March light does when winter has finally released its hold. "Yes," I said. She went back to her chair, the one with the good light, the one she had claimed in the first week in this apartment and made her own. The chair beside the window was still empty. I looked at it once more. Then I turned and joined my wife at the table, and we sat together in the morning, and the roses were outside, and the light was good, and that was enough.